This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Embryos have a 30 to 60% difference in the predisposition to severe diseases. With ORCID, parents can identify their embryo at lowest genetic risk rather than just a random outcome. Our genetic calculator can show the impact of embryo selection. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert. Hey everybody, this is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I am back with a returning guest, Inez Stepman. I think Inez was on about a year ago. So Inez, can you introduce yourself again? Reintroduce yourself.
Sure. So I wear a bunch of different hats, which is a very cliched and lame way of saying I have sort of a foot in a bunch of different organizations and issues. But for the purposes of today, I'm a fellow at the Claremont Institute, and then I write for a bunch of publications like the Federalist or First Things or other places on the right. So kind of a freelancer in that regard.
Well, do you identify as a writer?
That's it. I don't know how to describe my job, really. Primarily, my day job is I work at a think tank. So that's really what I do. I do use the word writer in parties when I'm not sure what the political affiliation of the person is that I'm talking to. It's my little social out, but I do write a lot. It's not technically untrue.
Unrelated, we're going to be talking about Silicon Valley and how you hate it, but before we get to that, I think it's a funny story about, I think it's a little bit of gender dynamics as well. I got invited randomly to an unspeakeasy, like this thing Megan Down runs for women that are heterodox or something, and they can like speak freely. And it was really funny because a bunch of women were there and they were just very tentative about introducing their views and who they were. And, like they would be like, yeah, I'm Catholic and, sometimes I read National Review, and she'd be like, I'm a Republican. I'm like, yeah, I'm very right wing too. And they'd be like, oh, okay. I was just like the whole thing was like, everybody was mostly conservative, I think, and some centrist, but, they were like very, very tentative. And so I'm not like that at parties. I don't care. I just like put it out there. Obviously, like, I'm pretty much far right. That's what I tell people. and then we have to have a discussion about that, get it out of the way.
A lot of the parties we go to, it's the opposite. The second that you introduce any kind of pro-democratic, small d, or broadly liberal view, you're on the outs. No, I actually don't mind sharing my political views, but not with people like who you're chatting to at the grocery store. I don't want to get into a political.
That's true. Yeah, because when people ask you,
like, "Oh, what do you do?" or somebody you meet at a coffee shop, maybe party time.
Well, so actually, one thing is funny is well, not funny, but so I will say I'm a geneticist most of the time, and I think that works for most of the people I interact with. But there's a large fraction of Americans, good, hardworking Americans, and I'm sure you love it as, who don't live in Palo Alto, who don't know what a geneticist is. And so then I have to like kind of figure it out. I just work in health, like health stuff, healthcare. They're like, that's close enough, If they say biologist, they're just like, oh, so do you like study bugs? It's like, it's just like, it's a little interesting how I have to define myself. But I mentioned Palo Alto, I mentioned Silicon Valley. So you grew up in Palo Alto. We talked about this, I think, actually before the First Things piece. So there's a piece in First Things, Ambitious Nihilism. It came out February 2024. The links will be in the show notes for everybody, but if you want to Google it while we're talking. Silicon Valley's Tragic Arc in Federalist Radio, our podcast with Emily Jaczynski came out in January. Right. So January 29th, that's the date. If you guys want to look it up, Inez talks about her views, which are quite strong. So I do this because I think we hung out last summer in New York, and You kind of just said that you grew up in Palo Alto, and that's kind of like a baseline for what you don't like. I don't know it's like what you're running away from. You know what I'm saying? It's like that is like the measure, the standard that you have. It's like an inverse ruler or something. And so some people, they like where they grew up and they're very like nostalgic. Did not get that sense from you. So when you wrote this, I was like, okay, that's the tracks.
Yeah. I should say at the outset, I mean, I had a wonderful childhood, like mostly due to my family, my parents. I don't have that hatred of family or childhood that I think really is. I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I do think there's a certain kind of resentment that is the hallmark of leftist thinking. And if you wanted to be a pop psychologist, you can boil it all down to something like that. But no, I observed a lot of cultural trends begin in Silicon Valley. I went to high school there in the mid 2000s. And I just saw a lot of trends, cultural trends that I identified as, even at that age when I wasn't very political, as having really negative effects on how people grow up, how they live, how they make decisions in their lives, how really moral formation. And I just was not impressed with the people there, just fundamentally not impressed morally, not even impressed on the basis that you love, Razib, which is on the basis of intelligence. Not that they were stupid. They are more intelligent than average, but I just didn't see a lot of lineup between the self-conception of Silicon Valley as the outside of the box thinking, or really, really creative, sort of intelligent people who are striking it out on their own and working outside of the system. Really, I think Silicon Valley is very much the product of a system that produces a certain type of above average intelligence, midwit type person who is very much guided by being the person who was doing well in school, very much guided by being, the student who always pleased teacher and always knew what to do to get to the next level of the selective system. I think in my my piece, I can't remember if they cut this line or not, but at one point I called it the Chinese sort of imperial system with American characteristics. I think that's very much what it is. And I was not impressed on any level growing up. And maybe it did cure me, or depending how you look on it, I would say it cured me of thinking that the American elite is truly elite on the one hand. And then if you were in opposition to the way I see the world, you might say that, it gave me a unhealthy appreciation for the plebs.
Yeah, so before we go on, I want to situate what you mean by Silicon Valley for about 50% of the listeners who are not going to be American, just going by the demographics, So, because Silicon Valley, it's a term people used, used to be orange orchards and groves and stuff like that. And basically, it's just a string of, well, I don't want to say suburbs. It's a string of towns, cities, medium-sized cities between the south of San Francisco on the peninsula, and you go south along the bay, all the way to San Jose, which is the end of Silicon Valley. It's probably the Silicon Valley city in a way, but San Jose is huge, and it's not like Palo Alto. Palo Alto is like a refined, intense distillation of Silicon Valley. Palo Alto, Mountain View, Cupertino. These are the archetypical Silicon Valley cities, not quite as large as San Jose, not quite as diverse socioeconomically, et cetera, like that. It's what you're talking about. So I don't think you said the Chinese bureaucrats or the Mandarins. In the piece, you talked about it extensively in the Federalist Radio Hour. So just to, in my own words, just to reframe, as I'm listening to you articulate this, it's almost like you're saying it's a nation. It's like Korea. Like in Korea, everyone is doing tests from when they're like 3 years old, and everyone's expected to go to college and all this stuff. And but a lot of Koreans will tell you it beats creativity and independence out of them, and it creates excellent mediocrities. That's one way you could define it in terms of kind of, as you said, like focusing on, from an engineering perspective, they focus on the specifications, so they're focusing right on the list of things that they need to do to like clear their Kanban or whatever. and like move on to the next step. Whereas, you're talking like this world-shaking Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. What we imagine is like, what do they do to make a better world? Like, what's the big question, that they're trying to answer? Or like, if you want to be more explicit about the business aspect, 0 to 1, Peter Thiel, which is like, how do we get a monopoly, right? Those are really, really, really big things to do. And I guess what you're saying is the type of people you grew up with, they actually were not capable of achieving those things because the mentality, the creativity, the flexibility was beaten out of them. That's what I got from listening to you. Do you think that that's correct, or like, do you have any disagreements with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a more philosophical and moral component to the critique that isn't coming through in the way you're repeating it back to me. Although I agree with everything that you said, I just think Silicon Valley elites fail on both the Western post-Christian kind of definitions, meaning the moral dimension, but also on the pagan ones. I guess you could that would be one way of phrasing it. I don't see them producing the kind of people, or I don't see them as the kind of people who should be remaking the world on the basis of real, excellence, I guess, is the
Sure.
And they claim that power in a very direct way. And there's an obsession metaphysically. There's an obsession in Silicon Valley with what you would call, you said they avoid big questions. I don't think they avoid big questions. I just think they're very rudimentary in answering them. The best example I can think of is, I think it was Brian Johnson, who, without any hint of irony or understanding that he was using phrases that have been used before, said very unironically, "Oh, it's year 0," right? And you can make an argument that technological change will be so rapid, and not only in the last 10 years, but in the next 10 years, next 15 years, next 50 years, that we won't be able, and that's the argument he was making, we essentially won't be able to recognize the human species. And there's a lot to be said there. But the fact that he can so blithely say year 0, not even realizing really basic history of the 20th century with that phrase, shows the shallowness of people who are making claims to be sort of these Promethean giants who are going to remake the world. Most of them actually aren't, but the technologies that they are wielding and creating are so new and so in many ways dangerous that they wield this power, but they really haven't done any serious work on, and it's worse than that. They don't believe in human limitation, and they don't believe in their own limitations, which would be kind of scary enough, but for the fact that they're obviously limited in some ways. Like, you can become a billionaire in Silicon Valley and not know that year 0 was used before, or you can, they're limited, they're psychologically fragile. These are people who rely on weekly therapist visits to get through life and microdose themselves to get 16 hours of productivity. And then at the same time, they're making claims claims to rule in a way that really irritates me. And it always has irritated me. It's just the simultaneous frailty of a lot of people in that culture juxtaposed against the claims that they make both about themselves and about the right to remake the world around them. It just has all the hallmarks to me of an overemphasis on essentially academics and the idea of intelligence without any sort of wisdom, obviously they reject religion for the most part, in a sort of unthinking way. I myself am not a believer, but in a totally unthinking way. But they also reject the classics, and they reject pagan wisdom. They just believe that it is year 0, and they have no humility at all about sort of imposing. They think it's almost obvious and not worth discussing that we are at year 0. And in that way, they repeat basic mistakes that anyone who thoughtfully considers the history of humanity might at least have some pause about.
Yeah, so I guess I have a question. So you mentioned Brian Johnson. So just for the listeners who for me, like, I don't think you actually have to explain who Brian Johnson is. Like, I know who Brian Johnson is. He's all over social media, but, for normies, he might not be quite as famous. So, he's kind of a weird looking guy that is trying to de-age himself. He's in his mid-40s. He's very pallid. And, he claims that he has an 18-year-old penis now because whatever stuff he did. I mean, look, he's a good entertainer, even if he doesn't mean to be, is the way I would say. Yes, he did make a lot of money, but Johnson himself, and so I want to drill into like who these people are. Is it the entrepreneurs that become kind of gonzo and weird famous, or is it the people you grew up with, in Atherton or wherever, like, these like, Tony areas of Silicon Valley? Because Brian Johnson grew up in Utah as a Mormon, and he was a Mormon until he was 34, right? And so he's an outsider to this. He's an aspirant to the ethos, right? And there's a lot of people like that. When I lived in the Bay Area, actually, I lived in the Bay Area when you were, like right after you graduated high school. I lived in the Bay Area from 2007 to 2011, and it was quite common where it's just like some guy would fly in from Rochester, Minnesota, and he had a dream, and he would go to a hacker house, and so a lot of the people that actually create the dynamism, I felt, were people from the outside. Now, yes, there are people, obviously, who grew up in Palo Alto and Cupertino, and they do great too. I think of them as, frankly, more often like, senior engineers or product managers at Google, kind of like the professional class that staffs these FANG companies, but the founders, I would consider a somewhat different class of people, and they are very strange too, and a lot of them are quite unpolished, and that's what you're saying about Brian Johnson, sort of saying year zero. Like, this is not a person with a broad, well-rounded education that kind of crystallized and developed organically. He's just like, I'm going to de-age myself. Like, okay, that's weird. He's just weird, but he's rich, and rich people, once you get to a certain level of wealth, especially men, they never hear how silly and stupid they seem because everybody around them, flatters them.
I mean, I wish that the billionaire class that we currently have was as weird as you just made them out to be, frankly. There was a guy, I can't remember his name, when I was growing up, who was one of these early Silicon Valley founders who had made his billions. And he liked to throw a party every year where he would use the tanks he bought after the collapse of the Soviet Union to crush like little Japanese cars. Like, that was his entertainment of what he did with his money. I wish they were more entertaining, honestly. And I'm not saying by any means that the sort of the people who made themselves billionaires in Silicon Valley don't have something. I'm not a communist. Right? Like, I think there's a reason that they made their money. I don't think it's purely exploitation or something like that, or that they don't deserve the money that they've made. I think I'm making a more of a similar argument as Thomas Sowell makes in Intellectuals in Society, where he says that academics and intellectuals often vastly overestimate the scope of where they are intelligent and expert, that they think that they can apply what they do in their narrow fields to the entire world, and often end up being some of the make some of the stupidest, unwisest decisions imaginable. And I think that's very true about this Silicon Valley phenomenon, right? Like, these are people who are good within a particular sphere, sometimes excellent within a particular sphere. Although I completely agree with your distinction about the sort of Mandarin class that are mostly staffing places like Google. My dad is was a senior software engineer, or whatever you want to call it, but doing research for advanced research for Microsoft, for example, and that was his job. And he saw the transformation over time very much as like shifting to an outward facing instead of the internal. And I don't understand a word of what I'm saying about the actual programming, so take this with a grain of salt. But the communication that is more between how to arrange the chip and then the hardware communication of computers, once it got to surface level programming for the user as the dominant output of companies, that it just attracted a very different sort of person, very different sort of person who it does become more marketing, more political BS, more, all of that stuff.
More word selly.
Yeah. And I think that's very true. But I think this is more an argument about scope of expertise. And because what Silicon Valley actually produces and what a lot of these people actually work on has such sort of societally transforming potential, I find the way they deal with it to be the assumptions of power that they have about themselves to be vastly overinflated. And for every really, whatever one thinks about Elon Musk in terms of, I agree with plenty of his political positions, I disagree with plenty of his political positions, like whatever one thinks about, like you have to say, like, okay, this is a guy who started multiple companies, like made them all successful, has something. There's a reason that he has the kind of money that he has. But there are a lot of people in Silicon Valley who are, let's say, less successful than Elon Musk, but still very successful, who have not taken that power at all seriously, I don't think, and are ultimately pretty shallow and fragile people. And again, it's not a crime to be shallow and fragile, but it is if you want to rule the world. You can't get through the day without doping yourself up, but you want to rule the world, it's a pretty pathetic proposition to me. And they do have certain actual, maybe we'll get into the actual, metaphysics or whatever. But they have certain assumptions about humanity, about human limitation, or the lack of human limitation.
Yeah, lack of.
I find really dangerous, and definitely not something that we should let take over the rest of our society without a broader discussion.
Sure. Well, let me, this is more of a thing in your first things piece. Your piece was, I think, like set up as partly a response to a book titled Palo Alto: A History of California Capitalism in the World by Malcom Harris, who graduated from your high school a year after you in 2007. And, we're talking about metaphysics and worldviews. Malcom Harris is apparently a Marxist, leftist. And so he kind of presented a caricature, unflattering caricature, but one that, you took issue with a lot of the details, like this idea that Palo Alto was some sort of Reaganite paradise and stuff like that, which, okay, yeah,
I mean, it's interesting because, as you say, I knew Malcolm in high school not well. I don't want to sort of speak for him, but Palo Alto tends, and this culture, by the way, like leans very far left. There are some critiques of actual radicals, Marxists like Malcolm, that are true in the sense that the leftist leanings of Palo Alto and other like tech hubs are in some ways very self-serving and superficial, right? They're obviously engaged in a incredibly ruthless sort of competition, but pretending that that's not so. And there's a certain valorization because a lot of in the Bay Area, there are genuinely a lot of 60s radicals hanging out and organizing in the Bay Area, a history that I actually think Malcolm lays out in much more detail than I would ever want to, not holding these people as my heroes, like the Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s, for example, in Oakland, and cop killers and so on. But that radicalism did get, it still exists in the politics of the region, but it is like ultimately a kind of superficial aesthetic. And I think he's right to criticize that. I mean, there is an obvious hypocrisy in the incredibly wealthy tech hubs who got that way through the biggest blessings of capitalism imaginable, right? To ascribe themselves to this kind of faux radicalism in politics is pathetic and laughable. But I mean, he goes too far. Like, just because they're hypocrites doesn't make them somehow like pseudo conservatives, right? He picks out a couple of dissenters, people like Peter Thiel, right? And instead of making him a lone voice, which really what he and Elon Musk actually are in the tech world, and I think you can probably back this up, right? People, you're in and out of the tech world all the time. I'm not saying there are no conservatives or no right wingers, but it's probably 8-1, 9-1, right?
That's right.
The idea that Silicon Valley represents some kind of like right-wing bastion of ideas is completely ridiculous. Actually, one of the things that like sort of personal remembrances I have from growing up there is a lot of the things that only hit the country maybe 2013 to 2015 were already full in force in my high school. Like the trans thing was already there in 2005, 2006. We had a guy who wore coconut bras and skirts and went to the women's bathroom. I'm not joking about the coconut bras, and nobody could say anything about it, right? Like it was already full on. A lot of the way that we that people think and talk about race, especially the kind of ideas that went mainstream in the mid-teens and exploded fully in 2020. A lot of that stuff was already happening in Palo Alto. And the one example that really crystallizes this for me is 9/11. Obviously, I was in middle school when 9/11 happened, I think 8th grade. And immediately the day after, the Palo Alto Weekly, which is the local paper, the day after 9/11, the 12th of September 2001, one of the leading articles was already about fear, about backlash towards Muslims. There had no backlash had taken place. They weren't reporting on it, but their top of mind concern after 3,000 Americans were murdered in a terrorist attack was immediately, and this sounds like the way we would respond today, right? Whereas the rest of the country, I think, even in liberal places, there was this kind of post-attack unity that lasted for a certain amount of time. I don't remember that really ever happening in Palo Alto. It was immediate. The return of politics happened the next day. And so a lot of the idea that Palo Alto or tech hubs generally are sort of right-wing bastions is, maybe if you are like an incredibly radical Marxist, you're disappointed that people say they agree with you and then don't give away all their money, right? But that doesn't make them right-wing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. So, I just double checked right now. Santa Clara County, which has like a lot of these cities, votes. Well, in the presidential election, it votes about like, 70 to 75% Democrat, right? So, there's some Republicans, but it's definitely like a majority Democrat. Not as liberal as San Francisco. I think part of the issue with the Bay Area. So I will say this is, when you're comparing yourself to Oakland.
Alameda County is the most left-wing county in the country as far as I recall, like in terms of registration.
Yeah, and so it's like when you're comparing yourself to some of these East Bay, they don't even have it's anarcho-tyranny. I mean, it's like a lot of left-wing radicalism. You're talking about the Black Panthers and other stuff. You go to SF, there's still, I mean, SF has a lot of tech now, but it still has more of a at least external like self-image of bohemian ethos. It's more liberal. So the South Bay is where, in the Bay Area context, I mean, let's just ignore Marin County and North Bay because demographically they just like didn't allow themselves to develop. So we can like ignore them right now. That's where like the more quote conservative but people are. But really, my experience is, I do go to that part of the country a fair amount, and I still have a lot of friends there. Is very few of them are like Peter Thiel, who is a serious right-wing thinker person. Most of the conservatives, or the people that would be called conservatives, are actually centrist. And then, against them are the liberals, who are actually just leftist. So it's like everything is shifted.
Driving is just differentiating the narcissism of small differences. The Bay Area as a whole is extremely left-wing. And I would guess actually that so Santa Clara County still includes some more middle class areas. And my guess is that actually within the tech industry, and specifically in more elite cities like Palo Alto, it's not 75%, it's probably 85%, right? And that places like Santa Clara itself, the town, are probably more like 60-40, because there's still more middle class people there. And that's the pattern generally in the country, by the way. Like, middle class people vote Republican, the very poor and the very rich vote Democrat. So none of this is a surprise, but yeah, I mean, I disagreed with the characterization that Malcolm made of nevertheless, I think he is right about some fundamental, the ugliness of the hypocrisy of left-wing politics within this space is hard to ignore, and almost raises, because I mean, hypocrisy is no new thing. I mean, the way I phrased it before, we're not exactly surprised when people, at least people on the right, should not be surprised when people fail to live up to communist ideals of wealth spreading, for example. But there is something ugly about espousing that kind of radical politics and doing real things to support it. I mean, making sure that the education system endorses the most radical form of left-wing worldview, really hating the country that gave you this kind of opportunity to success, hating it. There is something ugly about it. And he's right that it's not. I mean, I understand why an actual Marxist would object to the politics of Palo Alto. It just doesn't make it right wing. It is a different form, a different flavor of leftism.
Well, I mean, so I think people in Silicon Valley, so this is an issue in American conservatism, which is somewhat different than other types in the world where, it's like liberal conservatism or conservative liberalism, whatever you want to call it, where there's this free market, creative destruction, pro-capitalist, dynamist ethos, like, the libertarian ethos. And that part of it, you could definitely find it, non-trivially, substantial. Like most of the people that are giving to the Republicans. So I just checked Google in 2020, Google employees, 15% gave to Republicans. So of those 15%, who are they? They're not like church-going Christians. They are usually hardcore libertarians. And, when you're talking about patriotism in the United States, these are often not conservatives that even believe in the nation state. They are, literal globalists. They believe in corporations, in capitalism, and in the forces of history driven by innovation and technology. These are the forces of the right. Even Peter Thiel, who is, he has a defense of Christianity, which is very obscure and sophisticated. I don't want to get into that. He is more, he's not obviously a church lady, but he is more socially conservative. He's not one of these transhumanists as such, but he himself has been adjacent to and involved in, like, quite literally transhumanist organizations like the Singularity Institute back when it was still around, which was based, I think, in San Jose. So this is the type of right that we're talking about. But setting aside that, let's set aside like the political aspects. It's not a political aspect. It's a cultural critique. Is your critique partly that just these people, they think that the titans of industry, they are elite, but they don't actually know what it is to lead, or they don't actually know what it is to have a vision for society beyond, say, their own shareholder price or whatnot. Like what do they have and what do they not have? Like, how would you enumerate that?
I mean, what they don't have is meaning and a vision of what the good life constitutes. And it's connected to the materialism of various stripes that you were listing out before. Yeah, you're right. The people who are right on the right in these environments are often hyper-libertarian. They agree in all important aspects, I think, with the left in terms of the metaphysics, but either it's radical libertarianism or there is this shading into like a certain type of I mean, I'm reluctant even to call it Nietzschean because that's so overused, but and in this case, not descriptive exactly. But I think that's how they would see themselves. and it's like, just to give one anecdote that illustrates the lack of consideration to not just religion, but to the questions that would naturally rise in the absence of religion. I didn't know growing up that, I don't know if you remember, Razib, do you remember the Darwin fish bumper stickers?
Yeah.
You know, like with the little legs and it says Darwin,
Yeah.
right? I grew up seeing those everywhere. I didn't know
What they were responding to?
what they were responding to. I didn't know that Christianity's symbol was the fish, right? That's the level of understanding in this supposedly world-class education that's available in Palo Alto is if you don't, like, it's a response that's sort of thoughtless. And I think that there is a deeper crisis here. It's not an accident that these areas have really high suicide rates, and there's a constant discussion because it's a problem that, you know, the CDC has recognized repeated suicide clusters in Palo Alto, in particular, in Silicon Valley as a whole. It's sort of well known that there are high suicide rates in the tech industry, and there's a lot of explanation that I think doesn't get at the heart of what's going on, right? The usual explanation is, well, the selective system is too hard, right? It puts too much pressure on people when they fail to succeed at the next level of the selective system, when they don't get into Stanford, or, they don't get into, they don't get their startup funded, or whatever it is. That's when they commit suicide. All the research we have on suicide, by the way, shows that hardship in particular doesn't make suicide rates go up. I mean, suicide rates drop during wars, famine, pandemics, right? Confronting real adversity as human beings often does not spike the suicide rate. So, but maybe there's this form of pressure that does, right? There's an argument. Certainly there are high suicide rates in Asia that might be associated with the same thing. That being, I don't think it's the pressure of the system. I think it's the absence of anything else.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, so when you said the
meaning or value on anything else, and there are, just to finish the point, there are surveys that show, and the Silicon Valleyization of America, and why I wrote about this, not just my personal dislike of Silicon Valley people, is that what we see in surveys over time is the adoption of this ethos, which is a ruthless kind of ambition, material ambition, coupled with essentially a null set in the traditional space that would have provided meaning, right? Family, religion, nation, connections to nation. And then in that absence of old traditional sources of meaning, if you flunk the selective service, you either confront it before or after, right? Either you confront your lack of meaning when you fail, or if you're lucky, you continue succeeding, and then you confront the abyss on the other side when you've actually achieved everything that anyone could ever imagine. And there's that aspect of it as well. It's not capitalism and competition is not the problem with Silicon Valley. It's capitalism and competition without anything else, no other source of value or meaning in life.
Yeah. So what you were saying in the Federalist Radio Hour interview is, what happens? So you have basically these hurdles. You jump the hurdles or the steps. You ascend up into the ranks of the Mandarin or whatever, right? And what happens if you trip up and you exit out of the path? Like, you're not. I mean, look, there are plenty of people who go to Stanford, from these high schools, but there's only so many slots at Stanford. A lot of people are just not going to be. They're going to have to go to Berkeley or something, and like, what do you do then? Like, how do you tell your parents? Historical reference. I do have to say, like, the Taiping Rebellion, right? Millions of people. Well, tens of millions of people. I mean, it's China, so you got to say the real numbers. It's tens of millions of people died in the mid-19th century, and that was actually a guy who failed the examinations multiple times. And so his solution was, he's the son of God. So, I mean, there's a pressure cooker, and I have friends who went to, I have a couple of friends who went to, much younger than me, who went to Cupertino High School. There were suicides there too. This Cupertino High School is very, very Asian immigrant, tech Asian, and there's just a lot of pressure to succeed. I think what you're saying is there's a lot of things that we know in the broader culture about Silicon Valley, and like let's enumerate or let's list what's going on. Like 63 unicorns from founders in Silicon Valley. These like big culture shaping companies like Facebook / Meta, Google Alphabet, et cetera, et cetera. In the 20th century, we had the Midwestern industrial might. In the 19th century, we had the Yankee, clipper ships, these traders. Well, today in the 21st century, what really, really sets America apart, a value add as distinctive right now, is these technological companies, which the Chinese have theirs as well, but they're imitating ours, right? So we supposedly have this innovation, and we have all this VC investment in this area of the country. That's what we know, and I think what you're getting at is, aside from that, everyone's so busy, racing in this little maze towards tech utopia. There's nothing else there. Kind of an emptiness, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't have an objection to capitalism and competition. I think that's the difference between me and Malcolm, right? I don't think the competition itself is the problem. But when it's in absence, and again, you see it in polls asking people, for example, there's long-term Pew surveys that ask 20-year-olds, how important are these various things to what you want out of life, like the good life, right? And what we've seen is a decline in virtually every value, from religion to building a family is very important, getting married is very important. All of those things are on rapid decline in the last 30 years. The only thing that's climbing is I need to make a lot of money. And I do think this goes to the critique of conservatism against both the left and of libertarianism, which is essentially, yeah, capitalism is a great tool. It produces enormous wealth, and it provides better what people want than any other system in the world. But it can't tell you what you ought to want. It doesn't answer those kinds of questions by itself. And so I think the leftist critique of Palo Alto is, well, capitalism is the problem, the wealth is the problem, the ruthless competition is the problem, right? And I think the other answer coming from the right is, and I would say the non-libertarian right, the more like the Solzhenitsyn right, more than anything else, like the critique of both, left liberalism and of state communism, for example, is that the problem isn't material to begin with. Capitalism is really good at solving material problems, but that's not the only thing that man needs to solve to live a good life. And by good life, I mean, in the most basic sense, a life where you don't want to end it. And that is what's going on. And to the extent that these problems matter beyond the tech industry, it's because America is becoming more and more psychologically and metaphysically aligned with Palo Alto and Silicon Valley, even if they don't work in the tech industry. And we see the results. I don't see these places or these adults that I grew up around as admirable in any way, or anyone would, after watching them in their intimate lives, right? I don't think that they're a good model for what people should want to live their lives as. And fundamentally, that's a problem because their values are, they're evangelizing.
So yeah, you grew up in the 2000s, or the aughts, whatever, however you want to say it. And obviously, tech was a big deal then, but up until 2008, we had finance and the real estate and other things going on in our country. And after 2008, tech kind of absorbed a lot of the hopes and dreams of this country. I think a lot of the talent that was going into finance actually started moving into the FANG companies. What was Facebook, Alphabet, Netflix, Google, etc., Amazon, which is that's in Seattle. But in any case, so that was happening. Social Network, that movie came out, I think 2011. And it was a little bit glamorous, a little bit sexy. And so you've
Very hard to
seen,
do, by the way. That's another one of
it's,
my objections to Silicon Valley is singularly unsexy. But anyway, continue.
yeah, no, I think everyone who's been there knows exactly what you're talking about. But it is, the anti-aphrodisiac. But so and then like the zero interest rate period, the low interest rates, and tech just started like bulking up on workers, became culturally influential, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I feel like the high tide of that though is gone insofar, social media, cell phones, all of these things. It's not seen as the unalloyed good that it was. So are you still worried, or are you hopeful, or are you, well, let's see.
Well, I think the values are harder to dislodge than the specifics. I do think I wrote a piece for the Washington Examiner in 2022, early 2022, right after Elon had taken over Twitter and fired 70% of people. There's a very real question in the tech industry, but in the American economy as a whole and all those other sectors that you listed, right? How much of our GDP is just fake? How many people are drawing very nice six-figure salaries for functionally doing nothing that adds to the bottom line? And Twitter was an excellent example of this, where Elon Musk, I think the more important thing, like in terms of the example to the private sector that happened when Elon Musk took over Twitter, is not the free speech element, but the fact that 70% of people from a company can be fired without affecting in any major obvious way the actual technological functioning of the website. Not that there haven't been some technological problems since, but there were technological problems with Twitter before. Like there were little irritating things before about Twitter too. But the fact that you can fire 70% of the company overnight and continue the functioning of the main product, I think is really representative of how much, frankly, bullshit there is in the American economy. We have a vastly inflated idea of what, I mean, people are drawing massive salaries for doing, in the best case, nothing. In the worst case, a lot of that is political compliance. It's what Yoel Roth did at Twitter, right? It is knowing, gone are the days where I suspect that the people who major in queer studies and some, 200th ranked university can't expect to find a job. There's a very lucrative industry of essentially what in the Soviet Union we would have no problem calling political compliance. And that's, that's not actually helping us in our competition with China, for example, right? So I don't know. Do I think that tech itself would be better if it were balanced by other sectors of the American economy? Yeah, but that's kind of beyond my pay grade. I'm not an economist, and I don't even, not sure I even believe that one could predict with any seriousness what would be necessary in the future. And there is no doubt that the work that a lot of these companies are doing will be absolutely necessary, not just the economic future of the United States, but of the security future of the United States. Again, something that's not new in Silicon Valley. Most of the 50s and 60s were when Silicon Valley was first really built as a tech hub, an early tech hub. It was mostly on government defense grants, right? So it was connected to the Cold War and defense. So I'm not saying that, again, I'm like, none of this stuff, the real things that come out of Silicon Valley, some of them are dangerous because they require, I think, more ethical consideration. Things like, AI and your field, genetics, right? I think that we do need to have a broader ethical discussion about how we should put boundaries on those fields or guidelines on those fields. But I'm not against, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against like everything, the output of Silicon Valley. I think it represents a leading edge of, in the 19th century, the famous thing was God is dead, right? You have Nietzsche and Dostoevsky both recognizing, being really the only among very few people at least, who recognize what it actually means for God to drop out of the equation. And now in Silicon Valley, and even in the 2000s, but now spread throughout the whole country, whether directly through tech or just by the same kind of philosophical developments that happened first in Silicon Valley were both post God and post the death of God, and nobody in Silicon Valley, or very few people in Silicon Valley, even as they create these technologies that raise questions like, what does it mean to be human, is equipped to answer those questions, and nor is the rest of the country, right? So it's not a problem with the actual material output of Silicon Valley. They cannot lead us into the future in
the brave new world.
Yeah, in a deeper sense, they don't have the answers, and the evidence that they don't have the answers and that you can't ignore the questions is that their own lives are a mess.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. Let me just like drill down on a few issues here that you pointed out. So the Twitter thing, I think there needs to be a distinction here between the smaller companies and these big corporations. At the smaller companies, everybody knows what everyone else is doing. At the bigger companies, there are org charts, but nobody, knows what a lot of these people are doing. And also during zero interest rate period, when it was basically free money for these tech companies because of their valuations, they just went on a binge of hiring people. I will say that I remember reading a Wall Street Journal article, I think in 2023 or 2022. So they hired all these DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, whatever, people. And I'm not saying that they hired them because they were like minorities, although that is why they hired them. But officially, they were supposed to do DEI work there. Okay. And this one woman was laid off after 8 months, and she was a little frustrated because she said that she actually never did any work. That she was never assigned to do anything. She just would show up at the office and just, be on the internet. And she was outraged and like, what's going on here? And I was like, you're too dumb to realize that, honestly, you were not hired to do work. So they didn't really care. You were hired for your identity. Okay. So, this is, I'm saying this in a harsh way, but it's true. I can like put it in flowery language, but they were hired to like fill a line in some demographic chart, et cetera, et cetera. These companies, I can tell you from Twitter. I don't think my friend listens to this podcast, but whatever. I'm not going to misrepresent anything, so I'll be very careful. I have a friend who worked at Twitter until Elon laid him off. He actually was happy about being laid off because he didn't really like working there. His company had gotten acquired, and so he couldn't quit. Okay, so that's the explanation. And he would tell me, Twitter, their goal was just to basically break even. And, he had people on his team where they weren't performing, and he was like, shouldn't we just fire these people? And his superiors were like, unless they commit some sort of like ideological infraction, don't. We don't want to ride the boat. They're fine, whatever. And so that was just a culture of that corporation. And that's not the only corporation that's like that. There's some of that. And, I think I can say this. You remember James Damore, the Google memo guy?
Yeah.
I know him here in Austin. Okay. He's a nice guy. He's actually a lib, which it's pretty obvious if you talk to him or you read his stuff. But anyway, so he lives in Austin. And, one thing that frustrates him is, he can't, because he has like a background. He was a Google engineer. He can never go back to like having a signature again, because a lot of these big corporations, if you go to work at Google, if you work like a little bit, they'll give you the $250,000 a year. You have to work a lot to actually advance and become one of the big guys or the big girls that, are like making millions and like have a big career. But you can actually be incredibly lazy at these big corporations and collect, as you say, a pretty good 6-figure income. And there's a lot of people like that, especially during zero interest rate period. It's not as common now, but it still exists. And so this is what's happening at these corporations. So what do they fill up their time with? Well, you alluded to this, but let's be explicit. There was a whole lot of activism that was going on between 2019 and 2021. Like people like leaving work and strikes and all these things. Google, Alphabet has clamped down on it, but there was a massive hiring binge of people that wanted to be activists and bring their whole selves to work. I had friends who left Google in the mid-teens for this reason, because they were getting sick of it, because they wanted to create product. Why aren't they creating as many products as they used to? Like Google is still like a search engine. They bought YouTube, but the reality is they don't have that many cash cows. They just have big ones that subsidize all these supposed products they're working on. And you guys out there know that I love tech and I love that sector, but like a lot of it is bullshit jobs. It's like there's investors are hopeful that they'll get bigger, but if you have a company like Facebook, which has a social media monopoly for boomers and retired people, because that's basically what it is now, they never really have to innovate, so they could do like the metaverse and all these other things. You could say like, you got Talebism, like they don't have the skin in the game. Google was and is still a search quasi monopoly. It's going to take a really long time for them to actually get scared. And so they can just do whatever they want to. And whatever they want to is based on their ideologies, their preferences, the people that decide to go work at Google, which is a very different type of person than who was working at Google in 2002. Back when you were, in 8th grade or whatever, back when you were a kid, much more entrepreneurial people back then. Now, the people who work at Google are the type of the people maybe who would have wanted to get a job at the CIA or the federal government, honestly. I'm not going to lie. I mean, they're the engineers, they're the devs, they're like the elite, they produce the value, but there's all of these employees around them. And those people, we can say a lot of things about them. Not good.
Yeah, so I completely agree with everything that you've said. There's gendered and racial aspects to this for sure. In the sense that there are a lot of people who are essentially being given sinecures for their identity. $250,000 a year sinecures for identity. And because some of them are just content to collect a paycheck, a very nice one, and others of them are not content to just collect the paycheck, and they're conducting the revolution, right? Just to back up what you said with some general numbers, out of the Fortune 100 companies, so the biggest 100 companies in America, during and after the summer of 2020, from 2020 to 2021, they 94% of the 300,000 new hires went to people of color. There's no merit-based world in which that lopsided numbers are possible without direct racial hiring. And the left is always going on about disparate impact, right? I just testified in front of Congress on the use of disparate impact in Title VII in our civil rights law. What you can do, hint, not set racial quotas. That's never been legal. But it's very clear that these companies are setting racial quotas, and they're just setting aside positions for people based on race and sex. And now, I mean, you can say that since it's gotten a little tougher in the tech industry, I do think some of those positions are on the chopping block, but there's still an enormous amount. And that's what I say when I say, like, I don't know what percentage of our economy is fake. I really don't. I have no clue. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows how many of these positions at these companies are being propped up by a small percentage of people who are actually producing the value, and paying the salaries for, in the best case, people who do nothing, in the worst case, cultural revolutionary activists.
Yeah, that's fair. I won't get into details, but there were certain sectors at Twitter, now X, that were so what was happening is there were activist organizations that were doing audits of the diversity statistics at places like Google, Alphabet, Netflix, etc. And so the companies started feeling pressure. Obviously, once you have these pie charts, they want to shift the pie charts. So they were hiring a lot of people to change the pie charts, and they would put them into certain divisions that were not like economically productive, but they were excellent for the marketing and the PR. And one of the reasons that I think Elon Musk is obviously now on the right, but one of the reasons he got a lot of trouble is, like, when he fired all of those people, he fired all the fat. He fired all of those people. There are certain departments that I know that were hired. They were just stocked with people that were hired on quotas. I'm not going to say specifically because I don't want my friends to get in trouble. But in any case, those people are all gone. If you look at the photo of Elon with the engineers,
Yeah, I remember.
that's Twitter now, and that's not making people happy, But that's where the value is. Like, let's keep it real. So yeah, there's a lot of BS. Silicon Valley is like, there's the good and there's the bad. Patrick Collison, he funds this nonprofit called the Arc Institute, which is doing biomedical stuff, and they just published a really, you're probably not super happy about this, but well, actually, you will be happy about some things. They published a really new, cool way to do genetic engineering, right? So, that's good. Collison also funds an imprint for publishing books and other things. And then also you have people like, let's just, Lauren Powell Jobs. Her and Mackenzie Bezos, who was like, that's not Silicon Valley, but it's adjacent. Like, they basically like throw like helicopter, like big bags of money from helicopters at nonprofits. All sorts of nonprofits. And a lot of them, we would probably, both of us would say, are socially destructive, right?
Yeah, I think that Jeff Bezos' divorce is probably extremely destructive for the country in terms of handing over dollars to.
So I had like 3 or 4 of my friends who work in, I would say like effective altruism adjacent stuff in progress studies, and they were like, this is going to be like a big thing for the next generation, even if it's not spoken of. But go on.
Yeah, look, I don't know if we're going to have time in this podcast, but we have a big division. Every time that you tell me more about how genetics is progressing, the more I think that we need a level of seriousness around the ethics conversation with regard to it. Again, you're talking about questions that cannot be answered merely with the development of new technologies or the materialist success of those technologies or the people who created them. You're talking about questions that require reaching outside of the materialist paradigm to consider, let alone answer. Like, what is the duty of one generation to the next generation? What are the appropriate ties between them? The kind of technologies that you talk about, Razib, they cut the links. They both like create incredible control of one generation over another, right? Because the traits that will be selected for will no longer be selected by nature or by random, or by external forces of evolution, but by the particular traits that this generation chooses to have in their children. So on the one hand, this generation will have the most extraordinary amount of control over the fate of the next one that any generation in history has ever had. And that seems like something worth talking about. And then on the other hand, if we get to the point where, your actual genetic contribution to your children is a mere starting point for gene editing and merely the background canvas for the sort of genetic landscape of your child, we're cutting the genetic link between each generation and the next. And what that does, we've already seen what happens when we separate sex and procreation, right? And again, I'm not a Catholic. I'm not against birth control, right? But what we've actually seen is not hedonism and everybody enjoying sex to the utmost. What we've seen is like the collapse of sex, right? Or there are no real stakes for sex anymore through a combination of technology and culture. So we're seeing like the rise of the 40-year-old virgin, right?
Sure.
And like these are all things that affect the most fundamental questions of who we are. I'm not comfortable with Brian Johnson being the ethics committee on this, is I guess my final like summation of Silicon Valley. I'm not comfortable with guys who, frankly, their biggest qualifications are that they were either able to jump through the levels of the selective system and are moderately intelligent, or that they had like, one great idea and legitimately like had the business acumen to pull it off. Neither one of those things qualify you more than anybody else in the country to answer the kind of questions I just laid out. And I object to Silicon Valley because of the power that they've garnered through money and invention, having a monopoly on answering those questions, because they seem pretty important for the future of humanity. And I have no confidence in the quality of the Silicon Valley elite in leading us in a good direction on those questions.
Yeah. So I will say, like, let's quote the New King James Version. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So in that, there is actually both parts, which is the technological aspect, and then also the ethical aspect, right? And so, I would say the technologies that the Valley, and then also, places like Boston's Route 128 with the biotech hubs, these are their technique, right? Their technology, their tools, their instruments. The ethical stuff is just not something, technologists actually think about, I would say. And you were talking about, stuff that was happening when you were in high school is now nationwide. So that's 15 years, right? Let's go 15 to 20 years. Okay, so it's like, almost a generation. Okay, well, some of the stuff that is happening in the Valley. So you're talking about reproduction, pioneers in that. So surrogacy, Silicon Valley tech guys and girls are very, very, very bullish on surrogacy. A lot of them are doing it, and various things relate to genetic screening, genetic editing, not so much, at least in public. That stuff is happening, and so it's interesting to me because I do predict that as Silicon Valley is doing right now, at least at the highest levels, it's going to be much more common in the next generation. So that's not changing. In terms of like the ethical aspect, I think I think the reality of it is that once people start using something for their own individual benefit, they will stop talking about the ethics of it. So, for example, there's very, very, very little discussion. I mean, almost no discussion outside of extreme pro-life circles of non-invasive prenatal diagnosis, which actually was pioneered around 2014 and became very common after 2015. And so a lot of women in this country who are pregnant, basically all women above 35 are recommended to do it. A lot of women under 35 are now doing it as well, I think, when they get pregnant. And probably the number of Down syndrome, infants born, for example, is 50. It's half to like a third what it quote should be, right? So we know this is happening. There's no discussion of this. And there's no discussion of this because Americans are doing it. And I'm making this as just a observation of what I've noticed. Once Americans start doing things, there's no discussion of how scary things are, because once they do it, it's normalized, right? Like that's the new normal. That's what I would say.
Well, and it's incredibly difficult to tell people, you can't do this thing now, especially when it becomes a matter of advance. You're right to say that, like, basically, for example, these questions in IVF are basically not discussed except by an extreme minority of pro-lifers. Even the majority of pro-lifers in polls say they're okay with IVF. Well, why is that? One, I think, honestly, people don't know what is happening in IVF. The vast majority of people, they don't understand that it often includes selective eugenics, right? And people are not, so it's not just the concern about early fetal life, like bracket that's the entire like abortion discussion. What is the status of an embryo? What's the moral status of a human embryo, right? But even if you bracket that discussion, I mean, there are ethical considerations with the way that, and you're right to say they don't start with IVF, they don't start with the current technologies. I mean, I was pushed into doing that exact screening that you're talking about as the standard of care, and I really wish I had never done it. But my question to the doctor was, well, if we don't plan to abort, no matter what this screening shows, like, what the hell is the point of this, right? But I mean, so I agree that these things are connected and not new, but like we should have a discussion about whether or not we want to live in Gattaca, right? Whether or not we want to live in a world where the genetic traits of our children are selected. And you're right that it's not an easy question, because the line between eradicating, again, bracketing the consideration of abortion, let's say we're able to simply design an embryo that can never have Down syndrome, right? I think very few people will ultimately say we shouldn't do that, right? We shouldn't, if we could eliminate Down syndrome at the, now some people argue that we shouldn't even do that, but like, you know, as a consideration before conception, right? Before you create the embryo and sidestep the question of where life begins, very few people will say like, oh, we shouldn't do that, right? We should essentially, being able to prevent it, we should allow children to be born with crippling diseases, right? And the suffering that'll cause. But there's no clear line between what's a disease and what's an enhancement, right? The line between dwarfism and just being very short is not, in fact, like a clear pathological, you know, line. This is a disease and is genetically pathological. This is merely a disadvantage. You're on the spectrum of normal. I mean, and as the spectrum of normal shifts, like we become a different kind of being potentially. And there are questions about even about like the great suffering that people inherit. Does that make us human in some way? Does the possibility of suffering, do we like lose the ability, for example, to have compassion for suffering of people when suffering essentially becomes the tiny minority of accidents, right?
Sure.
When suffering is not, when you don't have that sense of there by the grace of God go I, when you see somebody who is born with something, you know, that is a heavy burden for them to bear the rest of their life, right? Like, what does that do to how we treat each other? I don't know, like these all seem like very relevant questions. And I remember all the way back in 2001 or whatever, 2000, the question about fetal stem cell research, right? There was a bioethics commission convened by the president, right? There was a national debate over, you know, what should we be able to do with regard to research on early fetal life, right? There's no debate. You're right. There's no debate. There's nobody bringing up the fact, oh, like, actually, these are very serious ethical questions. It's being treated as a completely fringe idea. But we, anyway, I know that it's your field, Razib, and it's not only your bread and butter. I don't mean it in the crass way, but also like what you're interested in and the advancement of human knowledge. And we are learning so much about ourselves, and there will probably be so much good that comes from that knowledge. But we are wholly unprepared as a society for even the starting point of discussing what the consequences will be when we start to mess with the most fundamental connections between generations of our species.
Well, so as you're talking, like I was just thinking, because you know we were talking about Brian Johnson a lot, and if you guys, I'm not going to post a pic. Yeah,
representative. You said he's from Utah. Yeah, but JFK is the representative of WASP culture, even though he was a Catholic, right? When you think of WASP culture, you think JFK on the sailboat.
Yeah. Well, so I, you know, what he's doing with his body, with his health, you know, in some ways is actually emblematic of what I think, you know, and like, again, this is probably going to freak you out, but we've already talked to, you know, that's what people are going to do with their children. Like, they're going to optimize, right? They're going to try to improve and get the best, you know, figure out the angles. You know, we're already doing this in like little ways, you know, but basically eliminating, you know, a lot Down syndrome, a lot of the other things. But you know, Brian Johnson, in a way, that's the future. I'm not saying this again. I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just like putting that out there that if I had to predict, the stuff that he's doing, like, yeah, it's weird, but that's psychology. Like, let's take me and let's figure out how to make me, quote, the best with all sorts of weird self-experimentations and stuff like that. I think that is a window into where we're going. Partly, it's just that the technology is getting more decentralized, cheaper, more powerful, more effective, and so it allows more people to do different things. The American ethos, also, we don't need to talk about this because it's like been talked about to death. But the trans stuff, one reason the United States probably is actually more advanced than other Western countries on trans stuff is our decentralization and kind of our consumer-driven ethos about medicine. Because once Americans get it in their mind that they need something or something is healthy, they're gonna get it. Whereas in other countries, there's more of like a top-down or communitarian consensus, right? And so, but this is, I think, true in general of this sort of technology. And this does come from, this is looping back to the Silicon Valley aspect, a kind of a libertarian, individualistic, consumptive, utility maximization, like this sort of like just let's hit all the metrics, let's hit all the specifications. We want a baby that fits these parameters. Okay, like this is our target. Here's our stretch goal. Like you could just like go on of I think what is going to happen in the near future in the professional managerial class. Now, the positive aspect, maybe from your perspective, is I would say I think a lot of Americans, though, probably half or so, they're going to be, it's just, they're not going to join. Silicon Valley is not going to be the whole America. It'll be a lot more of America, but it'll never be the whole of America. I think there's a lot of people who are not on board with this because what it is like hyper rationalization, hyper optimization.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about the scene in Faust, right, where they create a man, where the devil essentially and Wagner, the character, create the man in the test tube, right? And I was looking it up as you were talking, right? And it says we now.
The thing is, like, I don't need to exaggerate to scare people. The reality.
You're exaggerating. I think you're describing the situation. The question is what we do about it, right? Where Wagner says we now divest. I'm trying to find my place here. We now divest of all that dignity, though the creatures still enjoy it. We as men, with all our greater gifts, begin to have, as we should, a nobler origin. This is not like a new idea. The technology to do it in this particular way is new. But this does cycle back to what I said about Brian Johnson not knowing what year zero represents, right? Like the mind-body problem and the question of the soul, these are not new questions to thousands of years of human philosophy, right? But we're not even having the discussion about whether or not we want to divest ourselves of that dignity of being human and the suffering of being human. It's just going to become, as you say, like this consumerist technology that's available on a menu. And by the way, what does it mean to optimize, right? And how, and by what criteria? And that's kind of what I was getting at with the control over the next generation, right? If let's say in 20 years, 50% of the children are born using these new technologies that optimize for certain qualities that what is it? Scalia in one of his most famous dissents called the fashionable dogmas of our age, or the fashionable shibboleths of our age. What if people decide that what they're optimizing for in a particular generation, they're dooming not just their children, but all of the future generations to what people in 2030 thought were the most important qualities for a human being to have, right? Like our decisions affect the entirety of the species for the next endless number of generations, right? The parameters that our fashionable dogmas of our age impose on the next generation will echo. I mean, it's an unfathomable amount of power, and we're wielding it like a kid in a candy shop.
Well, so just like brass tacks, like just to be concrete, like I recently gave a talk at it was a conference about forecasting in the Bay Area But people were asking about like this sort of screening and these sorts of technologies, and I think what really is going to be big probably by the 2030s. So 5.5 years, but I'm giving you guys a sense. Autism and schizophrenia are highly heritable, which means that they're highly under a lot of genetic control, even on the individual level. So the heritability estimate's like 80% in the population scale. And so I think what's really going to happen is people who have autism or schizophrenia in their family, they will just routinely start screening. And we don't need to get into the details, but there is correlations between schizophrenia and creativity. Some autistic people have been known to be very exceptional in certain ways because they're not, quote, neurotypical. And so what you're going to see, I think, is among the certain classes that we were talking about earlier, you are going to see more neurotypicality, actually, than you had in the past. And I will leave it to the audience to say whether that's good or bad. But I think these are going to be individual decisions that people are going to make that will have collective social outcomes, right? I think this is what we're actually like circling.
Are you saying that in the course of screening out for madness, we're going to screen out genius?
I mean, it's not like, anecdotally people have always said that, but there's pretty strong evidence actually in the literature, and I've asked around whether it's a good finding, and most people think it is.
And I'm not an expert in your field. You can just observe it. Look at great painters, for example, and what percentage of them went insane.
Yeah. So we might. This is like a negative way to render it, but we might be seeing a future that's blander, more antiseptic. Kind of like everything's like the rough edges are shaved off. But it's kind of eternal ennui. I don't know what to say, but these are not questions that are often spoken of, and obviously like fertility specialists are not going to speak of it. I don't really know if we're actually going to have a social discussion of it in America, at least. Other countries take different courses, but in America, I feel like individual consumer optimization. I think that's if I had to predict, that's how it's going to go.
Nothing like will prepare us for these decisions, like the consumer choice and consumer optimization have done so well in making sure that, like, when I think about the things that make us human and the most indispensable contributions of humanity, they've always been in the deodorant aisle for all of the like consumer choices that we get. Like,
that's a fair
I'm not knocking it. I'm not knocking capitalism or consumer choice, but the idea that should be the sole lodestar for determining these questions is crazy.
Let's call it the Procter and Gambleization of the human race.
Yeah, I'm so glad like that Bayer and Pfizer are going to determine what qualities.
Well, as we're like closing out here though, but this is where like your communist adjacent people like Malcom Harris and religious conservatives or trads would agree, right? Where it's like this is a nightmarish future to imagine, and
I think so, for different reasons, but you do see that horseshoe effect, a critique of I don't know, it really, and exactly in this moment, it feels like we are living at the close, actually, of almost half a century of materialism and hyper-rationalism, right? Where both, and if you look at the most recent developments in physics, leaving genetics for a second, right? And the discoveries in physics, there are good reasons to question whether a materialist analysis of the world actually reflects, one, the reality of the world around us, and two, whether that's a materialist analysis actually provides us with what we need to live good, virtuous, flourishing lives that make, life have any kind of meaning. These are like, it seems to me that we're actually at the close of materialism being the quote unquote obvious answer, the ever more obvious answer, or a kind of scientism. If you look at the popularity of the rationalists versus, 2010 to today, for example, or you look at, Richard Dawkins, who's like sort of hanging on of the new atheist left, right? What's actually happened in the new atheist left is they've converted. Some of them have converted back to Christianity, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and the other half of them, or more, majority, have converted to what is essentially a new religion in the fashionable politics of the age, right? Like, apparently man cannot live without certain metaphysical commitments and with the bare bones of a sort of materialist analysis of the world. So it's funny to me that as we're confronting these great questions because of technological advancement, it's clearer than it ever has been, maybe since the Enlightenment, that it's not sufficient. Like the current materialist analysis of what a man is and what life is and what the world is not enough. It's not enough. Not enough for people. And
yeah. So what I would say, this is let me just like distilling some of the less, the type of engineer mindset that you see in Silicon Valley, these optimizers. So what a man is, what the world is, what life is. These are just not questions that are on the radar, right? Like people, they exist in the world, they subsist in the world, and they're optimizing their subsistence in the world, right? So I think again, like this is I don't think, I mean, I don't want to get like too speculative, but connecting back to like Dewey's pragmatism, it's a very American tradition of practicality, of ingenuity and engineering, as opposed to these like this like getting all Heidegger here on being and all, you know what I'm trying to say? It's like these are like not the big questions are not going to be asked by these type of people. So I guess the issue here is like other people need to step in and make their voice heard. Right now they're not. Right now they're not. Like, people are just.
That is a political question, right? It's a political question, not only in the more basic sense of, who is going to make these decisions, but also in, look, the political system, whether people like it or not, the political system in this country has demanded a lot from the average citizen. And I would argue that Americans have lived up to those demands for more than any nation on earth. But I don't know that as a people we're up to making or answering these questions anymore. Even when I think about the decline in my own lifetime from the discussion of bioethics around stem cell research versus the way that we accept IVF. And I'm not by any means saying like, oh, we should ban IVF tomorrow. Okay. I'm just saying like the nature of those discussions in the public square is so degraded to the point, and it does remind me, to maybe finish out on this point, it does remind me of the way those questions are considered or were considered in Silicon Valley versus the rest of the country, right? The rest of the country had a discussion about stem cell research. In Silicon Valley, there was the Darwin fish that nobody even knew what it was satirizing because those questions are considered closed. And we are on the cusp of the necessity of reopening those questions. And I don't see any evidence that people are either in the elite or like the average American is in a place to thoughtfully reopen any of those questions. But it seems to me to be like so necessary, in contrast to the way that we're just accepting these truly revolutionary technologies and how they're going to govern who we are and who our children are. We're not even like, the polls don't show that anybody is really interested in having a conversation about that.
Yeah, I will say, I did enjoy this conversation with you partly because, we're talking about the future in a real way, like future is a concrete thing. I think a lot of our public and political discussions, it's like as we're recording right now, MAGA is still a thing. Maybe someone will listen to this podcast 5 years from now, they'll not know what MAGA is, but Make America Great Again. But that whole idea, make it great again, Trump is a creature of the 1980s. Like, this is a very backward looking, looking back to the 20th century when we were great. You talk about the left, with Black Lives Matter and all these. I mean, look, it was just basically rewarmed 60s radicalism in a lot of ways. There isn't really any new ideas, a new vision for the future of how we organize human life in the United States and how we should. That's advanced beyond the second half of the 20th century, and I think that's a problem because our technology has advanced way beyond the second half of the 20th century. And that disjunction,
human life will be reorganized for us if we don't start participating in those decisions.
Sure, exactly. It's not going to be up to us if we just keep. I mean, this sounds apocalyptic, but it's probably true. It's not going to be up to us if we, don't keep our eyes on the ball here. Like, the ball is going to go out of sight, and it's going to have its own logic, and it's just. That's my cheery ending to this conversation, but I'm keeping it real. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Like, if we don't pay attention, like, weird stuff is gonna happen, and then next thing you know, we're like in a box that we can't get back out of, right? So let's keep out of the box. That's my final thought.
I have a more typically conservative, limited vision, which is I'd at least like to discuss the parameters of the box and to know that we're going into the box. I don't want to be trapped in a box that I'm shocked by.
Well, okay, so, like, going with the box metaphor, the issue is, like, I feel like people are walking into a box, but they don't know that the box exists.
Right, yeah.
And then all of a sudden, they're like, wait a second, how am I in a... and I'm just like, well, the HMO decided... And there was a law passed in 2012, and it's like there's nobody who's actually like stepping back. And I think what you were alluding to is like the big picture analysis of ethics, philosophy, and history that our elites are lacking, as opposed to engineering, focus on the particulars. People are not looking at the big picture and not giving big picture answers and asking big picture questions. And so we're like converging on these outcomes where everyone can be quite unhappy in the aggregate with choices that they individually made as their preferred outcome, right?
Yeah, it turns out that human beings still desire and want things that are bad for us.
Yeah, I should go get some ice cream right now. All right, Inez, it was great talking to you.
It was great to talk to you, Razib.
Even if you and your partner are healthy, there's still a chance your child can develop a serious genetic disease. This is because every embryo has new changes not present in either parent. Most of the time, these are benign, but sometimes they can be catastrophic. Orchid's whole genome embryo reports directly screen the embryo and analyze these de novo genetic mutations. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert.
This podcast for kids